Where we are here now, we're on the Brisbane River up near the northern end of it, where you've got about approximately 11 crossings of the Brisbane River. And I dare say, as you notice yourself, it's a beautiful place to be. It's certainly, I think you could say, it has a feeling about it. This country here, is part of what's called the Waka Waka language group. The language group goes all the way to just north of Bundaberg. It goes west of the Great Dividing Range with the people called the Jawa, which is the fire people. And the Waka Waka language, each sub-group, family group, they were divided into tribes. The tribes took on their own dialect. So the people in this country where we're sitting here now, it's called the Dungibara. Dungi is two words. Dungi means creek. Bara means mountain range or tribe, people. The people who lived on this land, they were known as the fishermen or the fierce people, the wild people. The Dungi Dao, they were known as the hunters. The Dungi Dao and the Dungi Bara were the main two tribes. They were referred to as cousins. They married into each other's tribe because they knew that eventually who went into the either Dungi Dao or the Dungi Bara, they'd eventually, in generations, go back home. The fishermen, they had their own totems, they had their own ways of life, they had their own ceremony. Each creek had its own different family group within the First Nation people of Dungibara that were caretakers for that creek. So these people would have travelled from the mountain ranges up in the Great Dividing Range down to the Brisbane River, and they would have travelled along the creeks and everything, and part of their responsibility was taking care of the creeks, making sure that their totem animals, not so much animals in their regard because they were fishermen, but mainly for the totems that were in the creeks, like the fish, platypus, turtles and things like that, that they were responsible for their welfare, their well-being, because they didn't have coals in them days, they didn't have Woolworths, and they didn't have South East Queensland Water Board. This creek, this place was their home. So the creeks were the main significant thing of the people within the tribe, as in they supplied travel routes from the river up to the mountain ranges. They supplied fresh water, they supplied food, they supplied shelter, and they supplied birthing places for when the time come for a woman's business to give birth to children. So it would have been their responsibility to make sure that there was no overuse of, everything had to be in balance. It had to be in balance for the survival of the tribe. With myself, with my becoming a descendant of the Dungibara people, it was through my great-great-grandmother. With the Dungibara people, the lineage, or the whatever you want to call it, it come down through the woman, the female. My great-great-grandmother, she was born in Crow's Nest in 1835. Her tribal name, her Aboriginal name is Bungari. Bun means like basically this place here now, and Gurri, it means grass hut. So that would have indicated that she was born in a grass hut in the Crow's Nest area. The Crow's Nest area, their main supply of water was what is now referred to as Crestbook Creek. Its Aboriginal name is Biara, B-I-A-R-R-A, which means plenty of fish. That creek, it extended from the Crow's Nest area down to the Brisbane River, down near Toogoolawah. And eventually when the station was established, they set up the station, Crestbook Station, down near Toogoolawah. When these early stations were established, they were established as basically small townships. Within the station, they had things like stores, a butchery, accommodation for the workers, chapels, etc., etc. And what was proposed to my ancestors was that you could stay on your country if you worked on the stations as station hands. The payment was cigarettes, I think a small percentage of money, and what they used to have in them days, which were called blanket rations, and they were given blankets to keep warm. And with the Dungibara people, they were given the assurances that they were able to keep their traditional ways alive. And one of the traditional ways was that the Dungibara continually travelled from the Brisbane River along the Crestbook Creek back up to the mountain ranges, because the name for the area of where Crow's Nest is, it basically means a crossing meeting place. It was an area where there was a lot of what we would term now markets and exchange of goods and things like that. So my great-great-grandmother was a trusted, you can't call them employees because basically it was slave labour, but, you know, they treated my ancestors well after the atrocities that was first committed. In that day and age, as now, as we know with the old coronavirus, you need a permit to travel across the border. A pass, we call it now. In them days, it was called a permit. To travel as an Aboriginal, you had to be eligible for a permit. My great-grandmother, Mary Ann's daughter, Annie, she did what would be called in this day and age a runner. She left country with some other Aboriginal members without a permit, which would have been very, very highly illegal and very, very much frowned upon. When she got to a place called Mount Coolin, she met my great-grandfather, Henry Marsh. He had travelled over from England, from a place called Staffordshire. He, at that time, was in that area, and he was looking for gold because at that time there was a bit of gold in the area. He met my great-grandmother, fell in love, and there was made an exchange. He was also a butcher. He had a pack horse with some packs on it apparently that was full of meat, and he made an agreement with her travelling companions. He would exchange the meat for her. Then in 1884 they got married in Bowen. My great-grandmother, she passed off as a Spanish person, as a lot of Aboriginals did because of their skin texture, and as you can see I'm pretty white. For myself, it was sort of kept quiet, but there was always that underlying current with my father and that there was this connection to something else. And one day I was looking through his stuff and I saw this picture of a lady, and it fell out from where it was kept, and I asked who was that, and he said, oh, that's nobody. That's just a distant relation, which I found out later was a photograph of my great-grandmother Annie. That was a picture taken on her wedding day. And in 1981, I got discharged from the Navy, and I travelled down from Darwin back down to Brisbane. I come down the New England Highway, and then when I come through Crow's Nest, I just got a very, very strong sense of deja vu about the Crow's Nest area, and it just felt like home. And just as the way sometimes life unfolds its history into your personal story, I did a little bit of uncovering and everything, and I found out that I was an Aboriginal descendant. And then I started asking questions from different members of the family, and even though there wasn't much to be discussed or spoken about, because at that time, being an Aboriginal, for an example, you weren't allowed to own your own home. So it was all kept pretty hush-hush, but as sometimes in life, things are meant to come to the open. And then I started finding out more and more about my own personal Aboriginal connection. And then just from there, it's been a spiritual journey, as in there's a tendency when we learn about our personal history and our personal story, things that were once hidden and unseeable have a tendency to surface. And from there, I've started on a journey of learning about my ancestors' country. And when I first arrived on country, which is around Toogoolawah area, I just felt it was home. There was a lot of confusion, but I travel, at the moment I reside in Brisbane, but I travel quite frequently up to country. And just over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of mysteries have been opened up to me and been unfolded. I have a deep, deep love and connection to country. I know when I'm on country, I'm at home. I know my,
Beautiful.
Well, when you're travelling down the river, even when you're travelling down the river, it is like finding an identity of country. And what I mean by identity of country is instead of just looking at the land, feel the country, feel the land. And as I said before, there's one way of like understanding the word burra, tribe, mountain range. You stand in certain areas and you look around at certain places, you can feel it's a connection, I guess. It's a feeling. It's like in my own personal journey, it's like learning about the name of the Brisbane River, Mina Ajin. Like the word Mina, like I said, means thunder. I pulled up in Esk one night at a service station. I was talking to the lady behind the counter, and we're talking about the river. And then in conversation she said, oh yeah, and this is the last big flood we had in Brisbane. And when that flood happened, I was in Brisbane itself, and I was near the Brisbane River, and I went down and listened to the flood and watched it, and it sounded like thunder. But as she said to me at the service station, by being a resident, and a lot of the other residents said, it felt like thunder. And she said you could actually, even though the river was away from Esk itself, you could feel the roar, you could feel the power, you could feel the ancientness of that river system rumbling through the earth. You could feel it had a life force, it had a current, it had the capacity to say, you may think you are in ownership of this country, but you are only part of the country. Something greater than you or me has control of this country. So in walking country, I often come up country and I just sit down and I just go with the feeling, and sometimes it feels like the ancestors are there. It feels like there's a veil. It feels like they're just over there. And for myself, I've had a few personal issues in my life. And when I come up country, it goes away. Through love, through that connection of family. Because I have a whole lot of different stories, I could talk about family and connection to country. And them little stories add up to big stories. And that strong feeling, that strong connection to country, it is still open now, it still exists. And as I've said, by speaking to some locals, I can see in the fierceness of their voice, the love in their eyes, that they, even though they're not Indigenous, they have that same love, that same feeling of country that I do.